There's a quote that John Carpenter has used in multiple interviews over the years.
There are only two horror stories that you can tell. I mean, there's two basically templates of a horror story.
On one campfire, you have the storyteller, his audience, his listeners, seated around the crackling flame.
We're all sitting around a campfire in the old days, and the medicine man is standing there. And we're a tribe, and he says, let me tell you where the evil is. It's out there beyond the darkness. It's the other tribe. It's the beasts in the woods. That's the evil.
In this story, evil is an externalized entity. It is out there. Cut to a different campfire. Same situation, same storyteller, same viewers, same audiences.
Same situation. We're in a circle around a campfire. The medicine man, the holy man, stands up and says, I'll tell you where evil is. It's right in here. It's in our human hearts. It's in us.
It's a lot harder to tell that story than it is to tell the story of evil out there, isn't it? And often, we are less satisfied by the results. When it comes to queer identity, of course, we have had both. There are some stories out there that turn LGBTQA people into some boogeyman out there, a threat to conservative normalcy. But other times there are stories that deal with the internalized pain of identity, struggling for self-identity, struggling for acceptance, struggling to understand the urges one feels at a given moment. These are both valid stories with a lot of complexity that can both be told in interesting and clever ways. But the problem is, so often, is that these stories are often not told directly. They are told through metaphor, applicability, suggestion, coding.
Now, Hammer believe you too are ready for a change. An absolutely complete change. Male. Male.
Now, I'm not here to argue that all horror is gay. That's simply not true. Horror deals with tons of different fears and anxieties, some of which are self-identity, and some of those can be applied to the queer experience. So I'm not going to say horror is all gay. That's all I'm going to say. But I am going to say that queerness is baked into its roots, into its foundation. From the very start, horror has been a very suggestive genre. Rather, I'm going to focus on how horror has allowed so many queer storytellers, be they actors, writers, directors, to tell their stories in a way that is compelling and interesting. I'm going to highlight how lived experience has influenced the works these artists have created.
The character of Jake is based on experiences you had in high school?
To some degree, yeah. There is a lot more autobiography in the show than I've done before. I mean, as you know, I started injecting kind of LGBTQ content into the franchise, starting with Bride.
Now, I can't cover every single queer movie to ever exist, but we'll cover what we cover. We'll get to what we get to, alright? Sound good? Good. Now, for this video, I conducted a couple of interviews. These interviews will allow me to give a more general perspective on the landscape of horror, one that my specific limited perspective probably wouldn't have been able to identify clearly if, on my own.
Hi everybody, I'm Chrystal Williams. I am a writer and podcaster, mostly known for my opinions on the Twitters, but also for my opinions over on the Gals That Geeked Up podcast or my individual writing that I've done for my own medium under Chrystal Williams. And we're a longtime friend and collaborator, right?
Oh yeah, I've known you for years, and listen. If I was going to do a thing on queer horror, you were the first one. You were one of two people who came to mind immediately.
Yeah, so I am Mary Beth McAndrews. I am the editor-in-chief at Dread Central, and I'm also the co-host of the podcast Scarred for Life and director of the upcoming rape revenge movie Bystander.
So you have some experience with horror, is what you're saying? A little bit.
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. Also, I just want to point out right now, if you're waiting for when the Babadook's going to come up, it's coming up right now. This is the Babadook talk. Babadook. The Babadook was misclassified on Netflix as a gay film, and it exists. It's a movie. You should watch it if it Ken's other film, The Nightingale. That's even better than The Babadook, I think, but I digress. Controversial take, I know.
You don't want trouble, but sometimes trouble wants you.
So let's get this first one out of the way. Horror has always been queer. Now, the start of the modern horror film can be traced back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is also the starting point for modern science fiction, so that's kind of cool, I think. And Mary Shelley was definitely not heterosexual. Now, even ignoring the fact that she hung around with one of the gayest groups of friends a writer could have in the 1800s, that being her husband Percy Shelley and Percy Shelley's very good friend Lord Byron.
Like in that time period, I think like no one was out, but it was very fluid. Like it was like her husband and the other guy they hung out. Yeah, Byron. Like they were kind of maybe messing around, and there was just like but I was like, you know what? Great. I'm good for you. There's just like a lot of, I think, like you said, queerness kind of around that book, that story.
Academics are still trying to figure out what Lord Byron's relationship to the Shelleys were and what Mary Shelley's involvement in that is. But what's not up for debate are Mary Shelley's letters, in which she details her attraction to women. She, of course, loved her husband. I mean, she kept his calcified heart along with her at all times after he passed. But Mary Shelley admitted to attraction to women. Now, you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with Frankenstein? Because, of course, a writer can write a story without their sexuality influencing every component. And in fact, I'd say, to an extent, that would be correct with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The story is not overtly queer, but it is queer-coded in some ways. Well, it's hard to read a book where a man creates life without woman without thinking it's a little queer on some levels. Especially considering that Frankenstein's motivation for most of the book, following his understanding of talk and language, is to find a mate.
I think queerness is baked into the subtext of the entire concept. Really. I mean, the idea of sort of trying to find identity while the world may view you as an inherent monster or threat is inherently something that queer people can like latch onto and create and reflect. That's one of the horrors of it. Is I'd say if we're going to talk about the film of Frankenstein, it's a film where the monster is created, but it's not created. It's created out of ego in this film, but the monster itself is just trying to survive. It's a person with feelings. It has sort of crude understanding of what the world is because it wasn't given that much like love and knowledge to understand the workings of what he can do.
All he wants is to find love, which Frankenstein deems unnatural, leading to him destroying his partially constructed bride. And this sets off the monster and leads to all the tragedy that happens in the last half of the book. The idea that you have to find love in a world where there's just no obvious match, there is not that other person you can really connect to. And that's an inherently queer story, I'd say. The Universal film doesn't help either.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
But of course, James Whale, of course, with making Frankenstein the film, like that right there is, entire.
And then Bride of Frankenstein, too.
Bride of Frankenstein, yeah. One of the least subtle queer films of that era, I feel like. Or at least of the 30s, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a
Absolutely.
bit. A tad.
Just a little. Just a little. Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
Now, Universal hired James Whale to direct both Frankenstein and The Bride of Frankenstein, as well as The Old Dark House and The Invisible Man. James Whale was, of course, one of the first major gay filmmakers who was not subtle about his queerness, I might add, to make a horror film.
There's that scene where he infamously drowns the girl, but the film doesn't frame that as inherently an act of malice. It's an act of misunderstanding and like not being told about the boundaries of the world. And I think queerness is inherently baked into that because people's perceptions of the monster is something other, right? It's the fear of the other that film in particular sort of analyzes.
James Whale's Frankenstein may not be as overtly queer as Bride of Frankenstein, but let's be fair. There's it's something inherently queer about a man living with his assistant creating life together. Yes, Fritz may not be as iconic as the later Igor from Son of Frankenstein, but again, they're living in a castle together, or rather a big phallus-shaped tower where they make life in a little room. There's some queer vibes there. Although, of course, Frankenstein is not as nearly as overtly as queer as Bride of Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein features the monster fighting for acceptance. Again, he is an outsider and his world does not love him or accept him. Because of this, much of his motivation is spent trying to find someone to accept him. He goes to Frankenstein to create a bride for him, not because necessarily he is wants to procreate and build a species of super unstoppable Superman, but because he just wants to find someone who can accept him for him.
Friend?
And when his quote-unquote perfect match is created, her immediate reaction is revulsion.
She hates me. Like others.
Even someone built for the monster immediately rejects him. There's a queer narrative to that. And this isn't even getting into, by the way, Professor Pretorius, played beautifully by Ernest Thesiger in the hammy glory that only James Whale could bring out of an actor. And of course, a lot of the actors involved were gay themselves. Colin Clive, who played Dr. Frankenstein, was believed to be a bisexual man. He dealt with a lot of personal demons, including alcoholism, which sadly took his life shortly after Bride of Frankenstein came out. But Whale surrounded himself by queer actors. Not Boris Karloff, though, I don't think. But beyond Frankenstein, you also had the vampire, one of the other iconic monsters of Gothic horror.
Like, one thing about the Gothic is, like, it's so campy. There's so, like, I think, when I think Gothic movies, I think immediately of Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, and I think of Crimson Peak by Guillermo del Toro. So I think of, like, these long dress, like, a lot of exaggerated outfits, like, a lot of, like, kind of very aesthetically driven, which I think people love. They love a good, like, sumptuous Gothic aesthetic because it feels so rich and so creepy, and it just feels like the quintessential horror time.
And while books like The Vampire or Varney the Vampire might be a little too dull for me to actually get through because those books are... look, have you ever tried reading those old Penny Dreadfuls? Some of them are not good. The two most iconic vampire novels of the 19th century that influenced the genre for decades, centuries to come, are undeniably Carmilla and Dracula. Now, Carmilla is overtly queer. That's not even a question. It's about lesbian vampires. Like... There's no denying this one. This one's pretty gay. All right, guys? Carmilla is gay. It's about a woman who tries to draw in another woman, seducing her to the dark side to drink her blood. It's overtly gay. They talk about longing to be kissed and being held in one another's arms. It's overtly queer. It's not really something we can debate.
It's honestly sometimes can be read as a almost conservative concept of what queerness could be in a way, meaning that, like, it's a group of people who in their eyes are monstrous and feed on others by churning them, quote unquote, into queer people. Like, that's what it is, right? It's like there is a lot of that sort of conservative sort of basis for that understanding. But it depends on the media that's interpreting that story, right? You could always flip that, and I've seen examples where it's flipped, where the vampires, in essence, are misunderstood.
You mustn't catch cold. Why are you looking at me that way? Won't I do? Yes, you'll do very well indeed.
It's a misunderstanding, and the queerness is inherent to the sort of ostracization and misunderstanding of those people. And I think that is very much the key component to a lot of what makes queer horror so fascinating, is that fear of other that I brought up earlier.
Dracula, however, as a work, can be discussed, because yes, there's a lot of heteronormative ideas in Dracula. Mina and Jonathan Harker are, of course, engaged from the start. They fall in love. Their relationship is very strong. Lucy has 3 male suitors who all come after her, and all are respectful of her wishes when she makes a statement about choosing which one she wants to be with. There's a lot of elements of found family and love in Dracula that people often overlook, especially in the adaptations. Oh, and of course, Dracula keeps wives. He has multiple wives, and he preys primarily on Lucy and Mina. So where would there be any queer themes? Well, let's establish one thing first, that vampirism in Dracula is inherently sexual. The process by which someone can become a vampire is by having their blood drained by a vampire and consuming the blood of a vampire. And this is demonstrated in a scene where Mina is forced to drink Dracula's blood after he slices open his chest for Mina. Now, in this instance, you have Mina go... There's no easy way of putting it. Mina goes down, or is forced to go down, on Dracula and goes into a slit.
Mina!
Now think about it. That image is suggestive when laid out like that. Of course, it's vile and brutal and completely contradictory to Victorian sensibilities, but the Victorian would read that and see there is some imagery here that connects to how Victorians saw intercourse.
My blood now flows through her veins.
But beyond that, there is, of course, also the first 100 pages of the book. For the first fifth of Dracula, Jonathan Harker is our primary protagonist. He's going to Transylvania to discuss the purchase of Carfax Abbey with the vampire Dracula. This first part of the book focuses on Jonathan being slowly drawn in by Dracula, lured in, for the intentions of being turned into a vampire himself. Now, it's hard not to read that as something of a seduction scene, much like in Carmilla, because it is written the same kind of way. The only difference is that Dracula and Jonathan are both men. And while Jonathan is attacked by Dracula's brides, it's undeniable that we see many scenes of Dracula leering over Jonathan, drawing closer to give him a little nibble on the neck. There is something erotic about that, and bisexual, and Bram Stoker's sexuality does not help with those points of discussion.
Bram Stoker never shied away from exploring the boundaries of gender in his work. Many of his female characters fall under the new woman archetype, often depicted as strong-willed, tomboyish, and outspoken, and not in a way that they're shamed for. Even in his later period, when he did shy away from most things society would find dangerous, his 1905 book, The Man, revolves around a female main character named Stephen, who was raised as a son rather than a daughter.
Bram Stoker's sexuality was never overtly discussed in Victorian society, and why would it be? Victorian society was all about repression. There's a reason why works like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde focus on the repression of the soul rather than necessarily overt discussion of personhood or what have you.
So when you think Dracula and Frankenstein, you think like castles and like long dresses and things like that. But I also think because the Gothic was a lot of repression, and there's a lot to investigate within kind of the tensions of a repressive society and what can exist within that society and what kind of rot creeps out of it when there's so much kind of like oppression and regression and just like not being able to be yourself in terms of sexuality. And I think so often fears about sexuality manifest as these Gothic monsters.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's a misunderstood work, by the way. I mean, people kind of think that Dr. Jekyll was making a potion to unleash his evil side, but no, it was meant to unshackle his cultural restrictions. Mr. Hyde isn't Jekyll's evil side, it's his unrestrained side, unburdened by personal restrictions, which is, I think, very compelling and interesting in that sense, isn't it?
Well, I mean, like Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde do that. That makes it an explicitly queer and trans text that, like, you know, at that time period, like that time period was so shocking, and now we watch it, and obviously it's a problematic gender representation, but also it is like a very kind of interesting for that time period look at someone who may be experiencing gender dysphoria. So, yeah.
Bram Stoker himself wrote several letters to Walt Whitman praising him and celebrating his literary talents and talking about poems that Walt Whitman wrote that were erotic in nature. Bram Stoker himself became a very outspoken anti-sodomite, which is to say anti-gay sex, following the trial of Oscar Wilde. Some academics have theorized this might have something to do more with him overcompensating to hide his preferences, sort of overcompensating to make a point.
David Scull writes in his book, Something in the Blood, The Untold Story of Bram Stoker, the Man Who Wrote Dracula. Stoker thrived in a male-dominated world in which a pervasive homosociability allowed more intimate male connections to hide in plain sight, at least until the scandal and downfall of Oscar Wilde, when the parameters of male sexuality became culturally electrified.
But again, it's up for debate. We have no definitive proof, but a lot of academics have read the works that Bram Stoker has written, read his personal letters, his personal accounts, know that he was personal friends with Oscar Wilde prior to the trial, and this 180 is very significant. And everyone knew Oscar Wilde was not heterosexual. He didn't make it subtle. People have connected the dots. Now, later works would draw into this theme as well. In the 70s, vampires became more overtly queer. You had movies like The Hunger. You had The Vampire Lovers, which was Hammer's adaptation of Carmilla, a very loose one at that. But most notably, you had Anne Rice's The Interview with the Vampire, which started the Vampire Chronicles series.
Let the tale seduce you, just as I was seduced.
The vampires from Interview with the Vampire, as written in the book, are not sexual beings because they're kind of beyond sexual attraction. They're more into aesthetic attraction. They would be described arguably as panromantic asexual, but very, very into physical aesthetics of anyone. They treat people like marble statues, beautiful relics of a time that they have long since passed. The act of drinking blood for a vampire in this series becomes an act of intense intimacy, one where two people are bonded at almost a lifelink level. While Lestat became the runaway character that everyone loved, an overtly vampiric, unabashedly, unashamed figure of just power and passion, Interview with the Vampire starts with Louis. In his perspective, he is the self-hating vampire, the one who's horrified by his new actions, which completely run counter to his conservative upbringing. In the books, Louis is, of course, the children of a plantation owner. He is a slave owner, essentially, and his own slaves are the ones who rise up against him when they realize that Louis has become something foul in their eyes. Anne Rice has been criticized for romanticizing the South and the Confederacy, but I won't get into that right now. That's subject for another video. What is interesting, however, is how Louis's self-hatred of his vampirism is reflective of a lot of people's internalized homophobia when coming to terms with their own sexuality. And of course, for a large chunk of the book, Lestat and Louis form a pseudo-family with Claudia. This is important to note. If we're going to be using the vampirism as gay subtext, Claudia is where the metaphor gets into some dark areas, because Claudia is a child when both Lestat and Louis convert her into a vampire. Now, what's very disturbing is that Claudia is played up as a figure who should not exist. The other vampires are horrified by her existence, not because necessarily she's more powerful, but because she exists at all. A child should not be forced to experience the eternal, unending hunger. Especially because Claudia doesn't age, she doesn't change, she's just birthed into this dark baptism of blood. But, that being said, the idea of two dads raising a girl into their lifestyle is, well, okay, so that's the thing also. It's not a perfect metaphor, because you do run into these more problematic elements. However, for the 70s, in an era where there was no overtly queer text, this was all you got, and you were happy you got something as well written and as good as this. But again, the metaphor doesn't always work with vampirism. There is always a little bit where it doesn't quite match up one-to-one, if you want to highlight certain components of the narrative while ignoring other elements where the metaphor breaks down. For example, Fright Night is a really great throwback to the older horror movies of the 50s and 40s and 30s. It's not overtly queer, but there is the fact that the vampire has a werewolf life partner who he just lives with at the house, and they're very physically affectionate and close, and you kind of wonder, what's going on here? What's the story between you two? The remake took out the werewolf boyfriend character, but it did give us David Tennant in leather pants, so I guess there's a trade-off somewhere.
I'm gonna pop your cherry. Ginger! Bring him upstairs. You got 10 minutes.
Now, going back to the 40s and 50s, as we just mentioned Fright Night, the Hays Code famously restricted what you could and couldn't show in a horror film. And horror films were attacked the hardest by the Hays Code. Universal almost closed shop following the release of Dracula's Daughter, another Carmilla-inspired vampire story that did in fact feature a lesbian vampire.
Do you like jewels, Lily? This is very old and very beautiful. I must show it to you.
But because of this movie failing at the box office, Universal almost stopped doing monster films until the 40s, where the monster films, barring of course The Wolfman, which is a masterpiece, tended to be more comic booky, more serialized, more fun Saturday matinees, as opposed to something that would actually horrify audiences at the time. Oh, and Son of Frankenstein was really good too. I almost forgot about that. That's a great movie as well, but I digress. But by the time we got to the 50s, something had started to change. Because you had a decade of these monsters being fun outsiders who had to be stopped by conservative society, audiences began to sympathize extremely with the monsters. There's a reason why Famous Monsters of Filmland became such a major magazine among horror fans at the time. Further, a lot of horror films began to follow a formula. Monster comes in, wanders about, doesn't fit into society and thus smashes things around. The military comes in and they stop the monster. Or the big buff guy with guns comes in and they stop the monster. This became a pattern, especially as audiences began to like the monster more, identifying with it. A lot of kids identify with monsters because at heart, they're people who don't fit into society, who may be made fun of for who they are, and who are targeted by bullies. Guillermo del Toro had a very interesting reaction to The Creature from the Black Lagoon, one that would inspire his later Academy Award-winning film, The Shape of Water.
You feel that outcast, and I think the monsters, you start pouring that empathy to them, and that's what happened to me, and I really had this vision of Julie Adams swimming over the Gilman in Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I thought that's the most beautiful image I've ever seen. And I really, at age 6, I really thought they're going to end well. They're going to end up together. It was the first time I saw it, and when it ended really, really bad, I thought I got to correct this.
This became more complicated when films started moving away from true monsters and focusing on humans instead. Night of the Hunter, Peeping Tom, and Psycho all featured very human boogeymen. But while The Night of the Hunter and Peeping Tom dealt with heterosexual perversity, Psycho dealt with more queer themes. Yes, Norman Bates he's attracted to women, and his mother murders women that he's attracted to. But let's not forget that Mother and Norman Bates are one and the same, sharing the same body with one split personality.
My mother, what is the phrase? She isn't quite herself today.
I'm not going to go into how dissociative personality does not make any sense in this film as it's described. It's a movie. Don't take realistic psychological perspectives on this. But what is interesting are the queer themes of Psycho and how that influenced films for years to come, many of whom were far less nuanced and far less subtle than Psycho. And yes, I said Psycho is subtle despite the fact that it has a scene at the end where a psychiatrist walks up and explains the plot of the film to an audience who otherwise would not know what's going on. And in fact, I believe Psycho is one of the first films to use the word transvestite on screen, a term which nowadays is a little less PC, but at the time was the appropriate term to refer to someone who dressed as a woman.
Why was he dressed like that? He's a transvestite.
Not exactly.
Now, Hitchcock included several queer-coded villains in his films. He was one of the big proponents of queer coding, actually, with his films that influenced so many others. But Psycho is interesting because Norman Bates is both dressing as his mother and, for a time, the protagonist of the film. Janet Leigh's Marion Crane is the protagonist for the first half of the film, but when she's killed at the Bates Motel, we are left with no characters to sympathize with, other than Norman Bates. And we see Norman Bates clean up the whole motel. Now, of course, Marion ran away from home because she stole some money. It would be very easy for Norman to find the money and take it, and that would be the thrust of the narrative, but we don't do that. Norman doesn't even know the money exists. So his actions aren't motivated by greed as far as we, the audience, are concerned. It's motivated by trying to protect his mother from her crime. He's a man caught in between great evil and great good and great tragedy and makes a choice that is interesting. But we're fully on board with it. And we don't realize really how fully on board we are with it until he tries sinking the car. Now, there's this mud pit out in the back of the Bates Motel that he drags the car that Marion came in, and he drags the car and puts it into the mud pit. Now, as it's sinking, the car catches on something. We don't really know what, but it stops sinking for a bit. And there are a few silent seconds where we see Norman Bates anxious. And we, the audience, get anxious. And that's where we realize, oh my God, we're sympathizing with Norman Bates. We're on his side. We want him to get away with his murder. Or rather, hide his mother's murder. When the car sinks, we have a sigh of relief and we realize we just supported the killer of the movie. So, and even after that, we're still on Norman's side to an extent, because he is, of course, stuck in this awful situation. Until we find out He is the killer himself. Or rather, one half of his personality is. Many films would later on take the idea of the queer villain who cross-dresses way further. Of course, many people know that Norman Bates was based off real-life serial killer Ed Gein, as are Leatherface and Buffalo Bill. But they're not the only cross-dressing killers in horror. Dressed to Kill, for example, features a cross-dressing Michael Caine, and he is far less subtle than Psycho ever was. Silence of the Lambs, of course, despite being a fantastic work of fiction, does feature Buffalo Bill, a man who wants to create a women's suit to become essentially a woman. But Thomas Harris, much like Alfred Hitchcock, takes great pains to differentiate their killer from a real trans person.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Clever girl. Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
He's a transvestite.
Not exactly.
However, no matter how much you really put into trying to differentiate the two, it's undeniable that audiences, especially those with certain bigotries coming into the door, will associate Buffalo Bill and Psycho with trans people. Like, it's inevitable. No matter how many disclaimers you put, they're going to come to that conclusion based purely on their own personal biases. And that's, unfortunately, the reality of this sort of thing. People bring their bigotries to a narrative, regardless of how often you try to tell them this is not the same as what you think it is. I want to take us back to the campfire for a second.
Almost midnight. Enough time for one more story.
Where do these stories fall in that? How many of these stories are the evil is out there? How many of them is the evil is in here? You know? So Dracula, for example, is that a story where evil is out there, that the foreigner, the man who preys on both men and women is the enemy? Where does Psycho fall on that spectrum? Is Psycho a story about an evil outsider who has to be stopped, or a man driven to dangerous actions by his own desires? It's hard to say. And is it incidental that these characters are queer, or is that part of what makes them terrifying? In Dressed to Kill, or Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, it's definitely the dressing like a woman part that is vilified, that is seen as the danger. In fact, with Buffalo Bill, his entire motivation is to take women's skin. So it's tied directly into his desires to transform into something different. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, even though Silence of the Lambs distinguishes that Buffalo Bill is not trans. But he is gay.
I met him just once. He was referred to me in April or May 1980 by my patient Benjamin Raspel. They were lovers, you see.
Hannibal Lecter only learns about Buffalo Bill thanks in no small part to one of Buffalo Bill's former partners, a man who was horrified by Buffalo Bill's actions. All of this can be read as part of the predatory gay trope that exists in media. Maybe. Again, the problem is you have to bring your own interpretation to it. Because this gay man is also one of Buffalo Bill's victims. He's not a predator. He tries to get his boyfriend help, which ends up leading to the boyfriend killing him. But is that a negative stereotype, or is it a positive stereotype to counter the negative stereotype of Buffalo Bill? It's hard to say, and quite frankly, it's also hard to give a definitive answer because it's all about how much your mileage will vary with Buffalo Bill as a character. But what isn't up for debate is that many people take the idea of the cross-dressing villain and take it in directions that are wildly inappropriate or wildly fetishistic of the character in question. Again, Dressed to Kill is a good example of this. But even outside of horror, you have comedies like Naked Gun 3, Ace Ventura, the list goes on and on.
Einhorn is Finkel. Finkel is Einhorn. Einhorn is a man!
It's funny, too. I want to go back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for a second. Remember Dr. Jekyll was a story about repression, right? Well, in the 70s, Hammer Horror released Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, where the potion that restricts your personal hesitations, your personal restrictions, it turns Dr. Jekyll into a woman. What does that say about our hidden desires, the suppressed desires that we're shamed into not revealing?
This is the testament of Dr. Henry Jekyll, male. Male. Male.
Now, am I saying that Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is some trans narrative? Yes, I am. Oh, very overtly, too. I mean, it's a story where a man converts into a woman when his personal restrictions are stripped away. It is a trans narrative in many ways, though, of course, not exactly a very good one. It is a good early one.
I think we should watch these movies, like, especially like James Whale films. Like, he was really putting a lot of his queerness into these films in ways that people weren't thinking about in the 30s, like in the 20s and the 30s. And you watch them now, and you're like this old house was a really incredible movie that's like very queer coded, and all of his stuff. I think it's worth seeing. Also, how like our queer like elders, our queer forefathers were forced to kind of put things into the subtext of their films, and what queer representation looked like previously. And it's so difficult now to exist as a queer person, and I think it contextualizes struggle in a really interesting way of like how that struggle for a lot of us has changed. Like, yes, there's more queer people directing and being able to make queer stories, which is great, but that doesn't mean things are perfect. The struggle has just shifted.
It was a great opportunity to give young gay fans representation and to see themselves on screen in a way that I wasn't able to when I was 14 or 15 years old.
I would say like Chucky's probably the most like outward, very outward about it, especially as it's gotten much more of Don Mancini's control of the series as opposed to the early entries. I would say like it's hard to find the exact queerness in the original film, even though I think queer people love horror movies, so I think that there's that there. But I would say like by the time we get to like Bride and Seed of Chucky, it's just like it's just there, you know, like there's a gay character in Bride, and then by the time we get to Seed, it's just like fucking John Waters in the movie. I mean, like you can't get any more openly queer cinema than just putting him in that film.
I think I'm gonna call you Glenn.
Don't listen to him, honey. From now on, your name is Glinda.
When it first came out, I think Seed of Chucky was it was widely mocked, I think, by the horror community. But I think over time it's found its audience. I think that the whole idea of that dichotomy between Glenn and Glenda, the two identities inside of one person, that the fluidity of identity, of gender, I don't think I've seen in a mainstream film like Chucky quite as overtly as in that film. It was so overt and so, you know, it hit the nail on the head. It knew the assignment, and it was able to show gender fluidity, I think, in a way that was really surprising. Do you have any thoughts on that too?
As over the top as it is, the film doesn't treat that as a joke. It easily could. It definitely feels like, I mean, because you watch that film and you feel mostly for Glenda. You know what I mean? Like, I would say that's the character you have the most empathy for, really, out of like anyone else in that movie, even the victims of said crimes. Like, I would say like Mancini does a lot of work to make them a very understandable character, which I find fascinating that the work is put into a doll. like the characterization is like a talking dummy, right? Like, and I think it's hilarious, but I also think it's like really gives an insight to what Don's perspective on it was. I mean, if we're gonna talk also including the show modernizes that for sure. It makes it like, oh yeah, non-binary, gender fluid.
Which is it?
I'm not sure. Sometimes I feel like a boy. Sometimes I feel like a girl. Can I be both?
So I think these films are really important to see how the struggle has shifted throughout the decades in terms of what it has meant to be a queer director, a queer filmmaker, a writer, and even actor. Just look at what happened to Anthony Perkins, who was the lead in Psycho.
Charismatic, romantic.
Women loved him.
But like his most famous on-screen character, he lived a secret life.
He was the most tormented person about his sexuality I've ever known.
it's really important to understand that context, especially I think if you are a queer filmmaker yourself, it is, I think, your due diligence to at least understand a very brief history of the people that came before you and what they have created and how they have created it and the conditions under which they created it, to have a better appreciation of what we're able to do now. I think it's super important.
But part 2 came along and it was just a strange movie.
I would say like a great Repression movie is, you can argue whether or not you think it's great, is Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
This movie is the gayest thing, and we did Xanadu last month.
I mean, the movie where he has shower dreams of his... There's a shower dream in a leather bar and whipping in a shower naked with another man. I mean, like, you know, the view of, like, Freddy, like, ripping through his body, like, him being a vessel for something that he doesn't understand.
In the film, they have, like, the female love interest who's just kind of there and, like, he has no chemistry with whatsoever in the whole film. But clearly, like, she...
Oh, yeah.
It's like... And there's the great scene where he's about to, like, be intimate with her and then runs to his best friend's, like, bedroom. Who's like has like the 80s band power metal bands posters on the wall of all the shirtless guys with long flowing hair. It's like it's like signs you may be gay. 101.
Just a little bit fruity.
Did you ever see the documentary about the actor from that?
I did.
Yeah, it's really good.
I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I also found it really fucked up what happened with him.
Yeah, horribly so.
Circumstances around the making of this film created a lot of hurt for him.
And I also think it's good to learn from the past, because even if, you know, High Tension is another, and again, like, it's not great representation, but it's an interesting queer film. So I think that's a film worth watching, but it's not necessarily a film I'd say is good representation, but I still believe it's worth, like, experiencing and discussing. People just need to be able, like, be willing to engage with queer films and keep their minds open and understand, like, hey, this is from a different time, so it might not be perfect, but think about the context, like what is cool in that context, or what is even problematic in that context, and kind of just looking at things a little bit with again, like, nuance, with some more nuance and everything.
And filmmakers have since then become more and more bold with presenting queer narratives. This is in part due to the rise of the independent circuit. With horror especially, indie films are a whole new ballgame. You can do so much with the indie market now that you could never do, even 15, 20 years ago. Blair Witch really opened the doors, but there's so many movies out there that have taken that even further.
The movie I directed, well, like, I'm a queer woman who directed it. A woman wrote it, and there are, like, a few women leads in it. It was a lot of men on set, just because we were a cheap movie, and it was, like, we didn't have time to find, like, all women, which was fine. Like, I didn't necessarily, because the topic of my movie is sexual assault, so it wasn't necessarily drawing from my experience as a queer woman. It was more drawing from other experiences I've had that was, you know, and obviously my queerness informs everything I do, like, because that's who I am. So I definitely, but actually, no, you know what, now that I'm thinking about it, there were actually a lot of discussions about queerness on set, because there's also a lot to talk about not toxic masculinity in the film. And we talked a lot about queerness and what queerness looks like in men, a lot of it, because a lot of this was about male repression. And so there's actually a lot of really interesting conversations I was able to have with the younger guys on set, because a lot of our cast were in their 20s, like young 20s. And it was either their first movie, and it was kind of a serious movie to be your first movie and all that stuff. And so we had a lot of talks about masculinity and that kind of thing. And I felt even more comfortable having the discussion as a queer person. Like, even though I'm not a gay man, I still felt like comfortable enough to have a conversation and be able to lead a conversation with people who maybe weren't familiar with that kind of language. So it might not always, like, you know, it may not always come to the forefront, but it's, you know, it helps to have that in case, you know, you can help educate on set, especially for people who might be newer. So yeah.
And of course, there are horror films that use queer themes already before, like Scream, for example. Scream is very queer. The two killers seem to have more physical chemistry with each other than they do with women. They have girlfriends as a cover, sure, but they feel more like beards when they have more physical intimacy with one another, even before they're revealed to be the killers.
I don't really believe in motive, Sid. I mean, did Norman Bates have a motive?
And that's not subtle. A lot of people have picked up on that. Jennifer's Body deals with overt bisexuality, dealing with the conflicts girls have with men, as well as with each other. And it's a great movie that I'm so glad is being reevaluated. I would do a whole video on Jennifer's Body, by the way, just focusing on that, because I feel that the text of that narrative is so rich, it needs a deep dive. And again, I want to point out that horror films have always had these political elements. The films of Wes Craven and John Carpenter are as unsubtle politically as they can get. David Cronenberg made a film about disease during the height of the AIDS crisis, that movie being his remake of The Fly, where the flesh becomes corrupted. But the horror underground of today is birthed from the horror underground of the 80s, where several novelists and filmmakers would tell stories underneath mainstream cinema that would then boil to the surface, and none of them are as noteworthy as Clive Barker.
I have seen the future of horror. His name is Clive Barker.
Clive Barker, I could do a whole retrospect on Clive Barker alone. In fact, I really want to. But Barker was a gay man who used his lived experience throughout his short stories, in particular in the Books of Blood, which were for the time uncompromising in their queerness. Rawhead Rex, very famously, was a short story focused on the dangers of toxic masculinity, crossed with mythological iconography and what have you. Now, when Rawhead Rex came out as a film, they turned this phallic, sentient creature who was very well aware of his misogyny into just a raving, drooling monster. And Barker hated that so much, he requested complete creative control over his next project, which he personally directed. And that project is, of course, Hellraiser.
Hellraiser, a film by Clive Barker.
We'll tear your soul apart.
A movie that draws from the gay clubs Barker was frequenting, where he would encounter extreme body modification and leather daddies. That's what the Cenobites are, essentially. That taken to a new extreme. And of course, while Hellraiser has become a cultural movement in and of itself, it is not merely the only text that Barker lifted from lived experience in when crafting something new. That's also not to say that the Cenobites are a one-to-one metaphor for being gay. Like, they're not. But they are a good metaphor for exploring a new identity and a new experience that then consumes and changes you fundamentally into something that is so disconnected from society, you are no longer bound by traditional metrics of good or evil. But if Hellraiser is Barker's most famous work, Nightbreed is his most overtly queer.
From the imagination of Clive Barker comes Nightbreed.
Yeah, so I'm not like a big Nightbreed head. I know a lot of people are. I saw it for the first time pretty recently, and I liked it. I think it's goofier than I expected, for sure.
Yeah, it's a little weird, isn't it?
It's weird, but like it does have that vibe of like a community that comes together because they are at the margins of society and they are being hunted and being like villainized. And when Nightbreed came out, like what year did Nightbreed come out? 1990. So it's like AIDS crisis has just happened. Clive Barker they're kind of still in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Clive Barker obviously is a gay man, so there's just a lot of that undertone / overtone happening here, like in Nightbreed. It's just one of those films that so obviously speaks to the queer experience, just in a very exaggerated form.
They have only one enemy, a beast called man.
So horror is gayer than ever before. If you've watched Knife Plus Heart, which is on Shudder, you can see that we now make horror films about gay pornography even. There's nothing off limits. Everything is on the table. If you have the budget to make your vision a reality. And because of the independent circuit nowadays with film, anyone with enough producers and enough resources can make a film. Getting those resources might be hard, but we see some filmmakers using almost nothing to make their films a reality. Take Jane Schoenburn, for example. Their first film, We're All Going to the World's Fair, was recently followed up by I Saw the TV Glow, which is A phenomenal movie that has gotten a lot of critical acclaim, again, from LGBTQA audiences. It's quickly becoming a cult classic among the trans community. This type of filmmaker had no resources. None. And the fact that we were able to get these great films is stunning, frankly. You get films like Spiral, which are out on Shudder. You got films like... And of course, you got the more mainstream films, too, that do the same topic. Which are many in number as well.
I do appreciate the recent trend of horror where queer characters... I have been feeling more seen in movies that have queer characters at the forefront now. Like, there's no, like, hiding it under subtext. It's just like, oh yeah, they're gay, or they're trans, or they're bisexual, or whatever. And I think that's been really satisfying to see as a horror fan, just to see an embrace of that, and it just sort of a normalcy, right? Like, I'm not going to say the movie they/them is good at all, but I will say that watching that movie, it was really nice to have a film in the horror genre. That's a film that's, it's not really scary. Film in the horror genre that, I mean, it's scary in some ways. The thing that I did like about the thing that I did really like about the movie was the two leads in the movie are pretty much both trans. Main character is trans mask, kind of non-binary character. And then there's a trans woman character. And they're both at this conversion therapy. So I was like really shocked that both of the, I would say, two of the most important characters, especially the lead, is trans. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool.
So here's the thing that's odd. A lot of these films nowadays get grifted online. There are a lot of reactionaries who respond to every new product as though it's going to be the death of Western civilization. Their words, not mine. You can always tell that they're a grifter when they talk about Western civilization like that. Because, no, anyway. It's not for lack of trying that these online grifters failed to turn Chucky into the next chapter of the culture war.
You know, I have a queer kid.
You have a kid?
Gender fluid.
They've tried. They've really tried to turn horror into a new landscape to grift on, but it hasn't taken root all that well. That is not to say, however, that horror is necessarily immune to reactionaries.
I think that there are a lot of pockets of, like, the genre community. I think there are some really incredible pockets, especially, like, queer pockets of horror, either within, like, just the fans, or within writers, or within the horror lit community. I think that there are really great pockets of support for queer people, 1,000,000%, but I also think that there are some really rotten pockets, too. I don't see them very often because I avoid interacting with them, but when I am on, you know, Dread Central's public pages, particularly on Facebook where older generations are, there are some of the nastiest things I've ever seen written about people when we publish any type of queer content or have a queer event. So, like, it's complicated, like it is in a lot of these, like, communities. It's like, yeah, there are incredible support networks, and there are also incredibly rotten people who don't like woke or whatever the fuck they decide to label it. Like, I mean, I don't really know if I can make, like, a full-on assessment about the, because I think it's hard to label it as any one thing, because I think there are so many, like, sub pockets of communities within, like, the online horror verse, and it's so easy to think of the horror verse as just existing, like, on Twitter, when really it's so much more complex than that. And I think, like, you know, I have made incredible queer friends and queer relationships from being online and in these spaces, and I've also met some of the grossest people, so it just, like, depends. But I mean, I think that there are some incredible people in this space. I don't think I would still be here if there weren't some absolutely incredible people. I just think we have to take care of each other and look out for each other. And I think that's what the horror people that I associate myself with are really good at uplifting each other and protecting each other. And I think that's what I love about the queer people and the queer horror people that I have found, is that we're all very, very supportive and caring about one another because we know how important it is to take care of each other, especially within our own niche that can be pretty toxic and homophobic.
So you're probably wondering, what are some films that are so overtly queer that I can watch? Well, I got a list for you. Here's your view list.
We're gonna do Frankenstein. Yeah.
Okay, so Dracula's Daughter is one. That is an earlier one where it is Dracula's daughter and she is preying on women, and it is very gay, very lesbian, very much like amazing early queer horror. If you want to see like the history and watch a piece of queer, like pretty explicit queer horror from early on in film history, definitely check that one out.
I'm gonna go American Werewolf in London because the concept of like a beast coming out that you can't control is fascinating.
Knife Plus Heart, quintessential like mix of gay, giallo, and noir, and it's just very stylish. It was made in 2019, 18, but it's like very much captures the Italian horror vibes. It's just incredibly gay. So very much encourage that one.
I'll do Seed of Chucky because of its inherent campness.
May, Lucky McKee's, and you know, people can argue if that's queer or not. It is a bisexual movie. May is a weird-ass bisexual girl. I will hear nothing about it.
Well, Hellraiser. I'm going with that. A very obvious one.
I mean, always Rocky Horror Picture Show. Just because, like, of course, you gotta watch it. And then, Jennifer's Body.
I'll bring up Final Destination, because I feel like that tied into what we're discussing. Like, I love Final Destination. I love those movies. They're so ridiculous. I love it.
And I guarantee you that by tomorrow afternoon, you're going to think of 5 more. You wish you said also. That's always how these work.
I'm like, oh.
Quasera, the Bone Woman. That's a new one.
Yeah.
And it's a really good look at what it means to live under patriarchy and what it means to try to escape patriarchy. And it's real good.
I really want to thank my guests for coming on today to discuss horror with me. I can go into any of these movies in more detail, and especially with Clive Barker, if anyone here wants me to go into a specific type of subgenre, a specific book, a specific film in more detail, please let me know in the comments below. It's the only way I know what you want from me. I want to thank everyone watching so far. The interviews will be posted in full on my Patreon and members page. Sequentially. I'm still doing the comic book ones as well, so I'll get to those when I'll get to these. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to me. I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care.